welcome to Shattering Myths. I am Yahowah. This program is devoted to those of you who not only recognize that all human institutions are corrupt, rotten to the core, religious, political, economic, military, and media, as well as academic institutions. They are counterproductive. Yahowah does not want you to rely on them. That name, if it is unfamiliar, Yahowah, that is the one and only name of God, according to God, and I think that he ought to be the authority on such things. I was not here yesterday, but I want to thank Scott, Larry, William, and Kirk for doing such a wonderful job in my absence. I was enjoying, celebrating, really, the birth of my wife and I's first granddaughter. I'll tell you that the process is a lot easier and a lot more fun as grandparents than it is as the mother and father as you go through all of the challenges associated with birth. But our granddaughter is in great shape. Our daughter-in-law is in fine shape, and our son is there with them celebrating. So we'll go back and forth to the hospital today as they spend their last day there prior to being released to their own home. Our little girl's granddaughter's name is Zoli. It's an old family name that they chose to give her. I do want to return to the news. We are still celebrating Sukkah, and we will spend the second hour on Sukkah, which was the primary subject yesterday and the day before. But there's so many things happening in the news. Let's cover it from the perspective of the Torah. The first is something that I shared briefly with everyone on Friday with IQ al-Rassooli. The Center for Security Policy released a poll, you can see it online, that should give all Americans pause. The results show that a startling number of American Muslims, fellow citizens, agree that the Islamic terrorist response is a legitimate thing to do. It's justified against anyone who would insult Islam. Now, this particular article doesn't say why that is. They don't give us any explanation. That's a shame. And that is because the Quran's 8th surah, which was really the first surah revealed in the Islamic era. The Islamic era begins when Muhammad was forced to flee Mecca in shame, following the satanic verses, following the imagined wild and winged ass ride to the non-existent temple in Jerusalem, and following his really deal with the devil, where he accepted a bribe from the Meccans for sex, power, and money if he would only incorporate other of the Kaaba's rock gods into his religion and therefore more fully integrate pagan Arabian mythology into Islam, which he did, and the Quran affirms this. So after these embarrassments of the imaginary knight's journey, the satanic verses, and the acceptance of the bribe, Muhammad was laughed out of Mecca in shame with very few followers, very few. And but on the way to Yathrib, today's Medina, he stumbled on 12 Arab pagans. And because he was burning in anger at his rejection, being mocked for the fool that he had become, he had the Arab pagans from Yathrib pledged to wage war against all mankind on behalf of himself and his wannabe god. Their reward, if they succeeded and survived the armed assault against humanity, was they got to rape the women, enslave the children, assuage their bloodlust by murdering viciously the men, and keeping 80% of whatever they stole. Muhammad would get 20% of whatever they stole. And if they died in the process of murdering others and attempting to emulate Genghis Khan and the other robber barons throughout history, then Muhammad promised them that his wannabe God would satiate their lusts in a perverted version of paradise with unlimited assault on virgins and rivers that flowed with wine. This was the beginning of the Islamic era. It's called the Pledge of Aqaba. And from that point, the next thing that we find is that Muhammad decides he's going to rob a Meccan caravan, his own neighbors. He's going to rob a civilian enterprise, going to rob a business, because Muhammad and his fellow Muslims did not work. They never worked. And as a result of robbing this caravan, they engaged in all manner of mass murder and torture and kidnapping and slavery, you name it, all the bad things that somebody can do. Everything except, in this case, rape, because there were only men that were part of the caravan. But then Muhammad had to justify it. Not only had he attacked in the pagan holy month of Ramadan, when you were not supposed to attack. That was a free pass time, particularly on a pilgrimage to the Kaaba. But Muhammad did it anyway, and he had to justify mass murder of civilians, and laying in wait from them, and robbing them, and stealing from them. And so he came up with the 8th surah. It was the first official act of the Islamic era. And he said that insults were worse than mass murder. Read the 8th surah, it's all there. Insults. So someone who insults Islam, according to the Quran, deserves to be murdered. Imagine a religion that's twisted. But it's what Louis Farrakhan preached. He's still loose. No one sought to arrest him when he incited mass murder, when he asked for 10,000 Muslims to rise up and kill 10,000 Caucasians, because he said that his God, he called him God Almighty. He's not. Allah is a wannabe God. He's modeled after Satan. But that he said that, the Islamic God, Allah, had put in his holy book, his Quran, that insults are worse than murder. And so it's there. So when Muslims say that anyone who insults Islam deserves to be killed via jihadist action, they're simply citing their Quran, their God. We shouldn't be surprised by that. This goes on to say a full majority of 51% agreed that Muslims in America should have the choice of being governed according to Sharia. Now, Sharia is based on a singular thing. Sharia is based on Muhammad. Period. End of story. If you ask a Muslim, what's the basis of Sharia, they would say the Quran. And that would be 1 or 2% accurate. 98% inaccurate. Less than 2% of Sharia is derived from the Quran. There really isn't any guidance for living in the Quran. The Sharia law is based entirely on Muhammad's words and deeds. The Quran is supposed to be Allah speaking, and Muhammad is only mentioned 2 or 3 times, although it is interesting that throughout the Quran, every statement from Allah says, obey Allah and his messenger, because Allah and Muhammad were one. There would be no reason to obey Muhammad if Allah was telling you everything you needed to know. And so in Islam, Sharia law is the Sunnah. It's based on the example that Muhammad set. And if you look at Muhammad, he set the most perverted example of any human who ever lived. He was a pedophile. He was a rapist. He was a mass murderer. He was a thief. He was a liar. He was a con man. He was a plagiarizer. He was a man who engaged in the slave trade actively, kidnapper, sold people for ransom, tortured individuals. an avowed terrorist. And you couldn't find a more worthless, depraved example. I mean, to say worthless is way too kind. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more negative, a more caustic, a more destructive, a more deadly, a more perverted individual to model a legal system after than Muhammad. And so for Muslims to say that they ought to be governed by Sharia, Muslims in America saying they want to be governed by Sharia, where they have no choice, where they have no freedom, where women have absolutely no rights whatsoever. They're treated worse than we would treat an animal being raised for food. Where terrorism is good, stealing is good, lying is good, rape is approved in the Quran. Where pedophilia is a practice condoned because Muhammad was a pedophile. And yet 51% of Muslims in America think that they ought to have the opportunity to be governed, to be ruled by this perverted, depraved, obviously immoral doctrine. Now, why would you respect a religion like that? Why would you respect anything that approves rape? Why would you respect anything that came from a known pedophile? Why would you allow a doctrine to advocate mass murder that was pronounced by a mass murderer? In a land that values freedom, why would you allow a doctrine that is not only wholly opposed to it, but actually was established based upon the slave trade? I suppose the only reason he would do it is that the population of that country, the leaders of that country, are wholly and completely ignorant, wholly and completely irrational, and also wholly and completely immoral. Those would be the reasons. It would take all three. Ignorance, being irrational, and being immoral is the only reason that a country would tolerate a doctrine as vile as Islam or its derivative, Sharia. When that same question was put to the broader American population as to whether someone in America, Muslims for example, should have the choice of being governed according to Sharia, to have their own religious law on them. And, if you really look at the Constitution would suggest, yes, that they ought to have the opportunity of being governed by their religion. But, of course, the problem with that is you have to look a little deeper. The Constitution does not allow for treason, and although the Constitution does not have a legal code in it, much of what Islam stands for would be opposed to the U.S. Constitution. So even though it is a religion in opposition to the Constitution, and of course it's a religion in opposition to most of the most important laws of the land. You can't engage in human slavery. You can't engage in kidnap. You can't engage in pedophilia. You can't engage in rape. You can't engage in terrorism. You can't engage in murder. If you bear false witness in a legal document, that is a crime. Most of the things that are approved in Islam, most of the examples set by Muhammad is illegal, and therefore Islam can be prosecuted based upon the legal system. But anyway, Americans at large were asked whether or not Muslims should be allowed to be governed under this perverted law, and 86 said no. 2% said yes. There are about 2% of Americans are Muslims. Now, for the rest of the 12% that didn't give an opinion, it does highlight the fact that ignorance runs rife in America. Now, this is the next part of this. Is that even more troubling is the fact that nearly 25% of the Muslims polled said that it is legitimate to use violence to punish those who give offense to Islam, for example, by portraying the Prophet Muhammad. So it's okay to go kill, to use violence against someone who were to draw a picture, for example, of Muhammad. Now, that to say we should be sensitive to Islam and not draw a picture of its, and this says Prophet Muhammad, he wasn't a prophet, but a picture of the buffoon known as Muhammad, it just says you've got no common sense. You have no morality. You have no sense of what's right and wrong. You've lost the ability to exercise good judgment. You've just lost it. You're awash in political correctness or in religion, and you've been rendered incapable of thinking. If you think that it is appropriate to use violence to punish those who draw a picture of Muhammad or who characterize a admitted rapist and pedophile and slave trader and mass murderer and terrorist negatively. And if you think that we shouldn't portray Muhammad accurately and that we shouldn't engage in anything that taunts this demonic religion, then you're no better than those who would lash out and use violence to kill those who do. Moving on, we had a news article that was sent to me by a friend of mine, a listener to this program, who says, and this is kind of amazing, he says, Mike Huckabee claims that Obama is just pretending to be a Christian. He doesn't realize that every religion is all about pretending. Those are true words. Religion is about make-believe. That is what it's about. It's about make-believe, making people believe. Mike Huckabee suggested that President Obama just pretends to be a Christian and knocking the president's handling of the grand poobah of religion, Pope Francis, during his visit to the United States. Now, I don't know how you could have kowtowed more to this man, have pretended to be basking in the aura that was the rock star of religion. And he said, I am disappointed if someone says I'm a Christian, but you invite the Pope into your home. By the way, Barack Obama does not have a home. And then you invite a whole bunch of people there who are at odds with the Catholic Church's policy. I think there's something very unseemly about that. That's about religion, isn't it? Mike Huckabee is religious up to his nostrils. And he doesn't think that it's appropriate to be critical of a religion, even when the religion is a complete fraud, a scam, as is Roman Catholicism. No, in his world, religion trumps all, and therefore it is inappropriate to even have someone around a religious leader that would be critical of that religion or religious leader. It's not the America that I know. Mike Huckabee. Huckabee also tweeted earlier Tuesday that he was disappointed that Obama was not doing a better job of welcoming Francis, despite Obama making a rare trip to Andrews Air Force Base to greet the Pope. Wow. Says, I welcome at Pontifex to America and offer my apologies that POTUS, President of the United States, will not offer him the warm, respectful welcome he deserves. Huckabee, the scumbag, wrote. God damn. These religious morons. That man represents the most destructive institution in human history. That man represents the religion responsible for damning more souls than any in human history. That man's a communist in a country that is distinguished by its capitalism. That's a man that is embracing the moronic concept of man-made climate change, all to ingratiate himself with the liberal elite. This is a man that calls capitalism the dung of the devil. And you, Huckabee, say that he deserves a warm welcome in America? Are you absolutely stark-raving mad? You know, religion turns people into absolute nincompoops. First among them, the Republican candidate for president, Mike Huckabee. Speaking of stupid, the Abominator. You know, wants everyone to just approve his capitulation with Iran. But you know what's interesting is that day before yesterday when everybody was speaking at the UN, and it was the Abominator creating, trying to cast aspersions on everybody in the world and saying that he alone is right and everybody else is wrong, and everybody else in the world saying that the Abominator in America are wrong. But Iran was among them. There were three nations in particular that just tore Obama to pieces, and one of them was Iran. And the Iranian speaker said, America has fallen to such a place that the Iranian nuclear deal was wholesale capitulation. Called it wholesale capitulation. In America, in New York, in front of the United Nations, telling the world what was obvious, that the Abominator couldn't negotiate his way with offering a girl with a lollipop $1 billion for it. No. The Iranians themselves called the deal total capitulation, which is all it was. And so, at that other part of the summit, you had the Chinese just absolutely laughing at him, saying that just look at the mess that he's caused, turning the whole world against the United States. And then Putin, most of all Putin. So, after a decade or so of the United States being the world's lone superpower, interfering around the world, particularly in the Islamic world, look at the mess that's left behind in the wake of their interventionism. Look at the mess that is in the wake of American diplomacy. I mean, we're trying to go back into Syria now just to stabilize the place because, as Putin was asked on 60 Minutes, well, don't you think it's inappropriate to prop up Assad? And he says, do you have any idea what would happen to Syria if he falls? Do you have any idea how much worse the government of Syria would be if the jihadists that oppose him come into power? What happened in Libya? Aren't you awake? And so he was just mock severely. But anyway, the Iranians said Americans totally capitulate. So if you're one of those Democrats voting for the Iranian nuclear deal, wear that as your necklace of shame. But the Iranian government went one step further. The Ayatollah al-Khamenei said that he would not allow the American capitulation to go into effect until the deal was altered to say that all sanctions would have to be released in their entirety. All sanctions, in fact, from his point of view, the deal was that this, what is already a one-sided agreement, that he said that unless the sanctions are lifted in their entirety, not just suspended, there will be no deal. So what's America going to do? It'll capitulate again. It's what we do. You already had a deal that was absolutely worthless. Accomplished nothing. I mean, it's the most one-sided deal with a villain. That's like telling somebody who is broken into your home and is got 10 guns, all filled with 10-round magazines. So I'll tell you what, let's make a deal here. We would like a 10-year agreement with a 28-day notice for inspection of your guns. And we would like you to remove a third of the bullets from those guns. And as proof that you've done so, we will make certain that we provide you enough money to buy 1 billion guns and 1 trillion rounds of ammunition. And all that we ask for is that you give us 28 days right after notice for inspection of your guns, and that you remove a third of the ammunition from those guns that you're pointed at my family. Oh boy, how do you negotiate a deal like that? Particularly now when the Ayatollah Khomeini is saying, yeah, man, there's no deal. You want a deal? The sanctions go away completely. They aren't suspended, which means that they can be put back into place if after 28 days notice and the approval process that we're not able to hide from you everything that we wish to use to destroy Israel. Yeah, there you go. In other news, Saudi Arabian authorities said that the number killed during the Hajj was not 717 as they reported. No, it was over 1,000. Because they only count those who were properly credentialed, who had filed the necessary political and religious requests and voucher forms, who had paid their permits to go on the Hajj. And if you were a Saudi Arabian on the Hajj and didn't buy your permit, if you were killed, you weren't counted. Boy, is that making merchandise of men? And that was the whole idea of the Kaaba in Mecca. You know, they had the only watering hole within a camel ride's day up the near coastal route up to from Yemen, where things were actually made along the coast, up to Syria and Israel, where there were actually civilizations. And they tried to capitalize on the watering hole by having a religious attraction. This was this rock pile, the rock gods called the Kaaba. And the Quraysh, being the leading tribe there, made their money by having the license to provide the pagans who would toss some stones at the stones, circumambulate the Kaaba, to be able to provide them food and shelter and water for a fee. And they had the license to do so. So the Saudi Arabians, the royal family, is continuing in the same tradition, making merchandise of men in a religion. So there were over 1,000 people trampled to death. Now, you know, it's just, the number of people killed in Islam is just astounding. But imagine 1,000 people being trampled to death. And that no one there was smart enough, was rational enough, was moral enough, had the good judgment to say, why don't we stop walking over people? Why don't we just all stop? If we just all stop, this won't happen. And of course, what were they doing? They were throwing stones at an imaginary devil. Goodness gracious. The next story I would like to share with you is that a little more from the Pope. We were considering his tortured experience where he was all but imprisoned in a tiny cell, a windowless cell, a cell pointed the color of blood, whose furnishings were the color of blood, with the only portrait of that of painful death. And it was in that isolation, where he was thrown into isolation by the Jesuits, because he wanted, when he was empowered, his word to be considered unapproachable. That if he said something, it was the equivalent of divine writ. It's the same thing that Roman Catholics have done throughout the centuries. It's church canon is how they make their decisions, not Yahowah's testimony. And so his words were considered the power of God. when he was empowered. So they sent him away to work on his dissertation in Germany, but no, he wouldn't have any of that. That was way too long. He didn't want to be a lowly little student. He wanted to be a dictator again. So he came back to Argentina, and when he came back, the Jesuits said, no, this man's a problem. And they sent him away to essentially solitary confinement, where he could either hang in his cell all by himself, or he could go and spend the day praying among a cadre of dead saints. Most of the time, of course, praying, bowing before a statue of the founder of the Jesuit order, the very man who surmised religion in the words, if the white that I see before my eyes is called black by the church, then indeed it is black. That I will ignore. In fact, I will go worse than that. I won't just ignore the evidence when it is contrary to my religion. I will believe, and I will profess, and I will accept the opposite of what I know to be true, to be empowered by, to be part of my religion. That's the nature of make-believe. So this Pope said, the man or woman who consciously takes charge of his exile suffers a double loneliness. Now, what in the hell does that mean? Well, this is what Bergoglio wrote. Who is Bergoglio? He is Pope Francis. He is Pope Francis during his exile. What it tells you is, first, exile. That he was in that cell because he was being exiled. That it was a punishment. This man who is now Pope was being punished by the Jesuits because he was uncontrollable, because he was a demagogue, because he was power hungry. That was it. He was power hungry. That's why he was being exiled by the Jesuits. And now here's a man that goes to the UN and says that the problem with the planet is that power hungry men are raping it. Pure hypocrisy, Mike Huckabee. He was exiled in his 50s because he was power hungry, because he wanted his words to be considered divine, unassailable. And so he's saying a man that takes charge of his exile, does that mean that somebody who actually takes responsibility for it? Wouldn't that be a proper thing to do? But he says if you take responsibility for it, you take charge of it, then it's like a double loneliness. Why? Because you have to admit the truth. So he never took responsibility for his exile. He projected his exile on those who recognized that he was out of control. It's exactly what happened with Muhammad. Exactly what happened with Paul. Muhammad lashed out at those who knew that he was a fraud, who knew that he was dangerous, who knew that he was demon-possessed. He lashed out at them. He didn't take responsibility for his own perverted life, but blamed everyone else. Same thing with Paul. You read any of Paul's letters, they're all about lashing out against those who would tell you the truth about him, who dared to tell the truth about him. Same thing with this man. Pope Francis, as Bergoglio, was an egomaniac, completely and totally out of control, uncontrollable, power hungry. And when he was sent to a timeout as punishment, he would not take responsibility. He continued to blame the Jesuits for his own behavior. He wrote then, this isolation is felt most acutely in prayer, when the exile sets himself apart from others in the quiet of a dark chapel, perhaps before his brother Jesuits have awoken. Yeah, boys, he's going to get back at them. You just wait. The Jesuits, you are in serious trouble. This man is power hungry. He's paranoid. He thinks he got up before you, and he's going to put you in your place. Now, this idea that you would feel, now you're the Pope. You're the man who claims to speak for God, to be God's representative on earth. And when you're in prayer, when you're conversing with him, that's when you're the loneliest. I'm telling you. This man put this in writing. This is a quote from what he wrote in his 50s. This is not the squandered words of youth. He was in his 50s. And he wrote that he was loneliest when he was conversing with God. He was loneliest when he was surrounded by the trappings of Roman Catholicism in one of its chapels. Now, if you want to believe as a Roman Catholic that this man deserves your respect, that he is representing God, then you are a complete and utter nincompoop. This man is a total and complete fraud. That's why he asked Boehner, a former Speaker of the House, to pray for him. He knows that God has nothing to do with it. He's more lonely when he's trying to relate to God than at any other time, because the real God is awesomely distant from him. The only God that he knows is the God of separation, the God of religion, the Lord of Roman Catholicism, Hasatan, the adversary. And there is no more lonesome position than being possessed by the adversary. He then said the exile also feels this isolation in the prayer itself when he contemplates the distance between his desires and God's plans. Yes, because his desires are the antithesis of God's plans. That's why they are so distant. They could not be more different. The nature of Roman Catholicism and the Torah.